Hello, Internet! Today we're talking about the way that our education system is shaped to help students internalize capitalist ideology. Specifically, I want to talk about the practice of grading. Grading teaches students that people are unequal and can be objectively, quantitatively ranked, which is the same basic principle that capitalism is built on. In this video, I'm going to explore the ways that our education system lays the groundwork for capitalism through grading, and hopefully present a persuasive argument for abolishing grading as a whole. Before I get into my arguments, I just want to take a second and hold some space for anyone who feels dismayed at the idea of abolishing grading. If this is you, I imagine you'd probably like to feel recognized for all the hard work that you've put into getting the grades you've gotten. And yeah, I want to acknowledge that work. I'm guessing it was probably exhausting. My goal is not to deny your achievements, but to see if we can acknowledge achievements in an inclusive way that doesn't elevate anyone over anyone else.
Part 1. Is grading necessary?
Why do we grade? Sit with that question for a moment. Now, you might be thinking, if we didn't grade, then students wouldn't do anything. And yeah, I would agree. Under our current system, if you give an assignment that isn't graded, students probably aren't going to do it. Why not? Well, because they've got other work to do that is being graded, and they don't want to spend their precious free time working on something that they've been implicitly told by the system isn't important. That isn't students being lazy. It's them understanding how the system they exist within works and using their energy efficiently within that system. Do we honestly think that if we collectively stopped grading, students would just come to school and do nothing all day? I mean, our behaviors are shaped by our environments. I was in a theater group in high school, and I worked hard at that even though I wasn't being graded on it. I worked hard because I cared about the stuff that I was learning. I wanted to contribute to the group's success, and I don't know, it just kind of was what you did. It was the norm. From this example, we can see that external rewards are not the only way to motivate students.
And they're not the only way to motivate workers either.
Another answer to the question of why do we grade is to provide students with feedback on their work. And yeah, some form of feedback is necessary. More on that later. But the problem comes when grades are treated as an objective measure of the quality of students' work. When a system that claims to be objective consistently ranks the accomplishments of some groups of people above others, like as can be seen in the case of the racial achievement gap, the message that sends is that some people are just naturally better than others. And if you don't believe me, consider the fact that the creator of the SAT test, Carl Brigham, was an outspoken eugenicist and thought that we needed to stop immigration in order to prevent the deterioration of American intelligence. In practice, grading ends up being highly subjective. Who gets to design the curriculum, grading rubrics, and make judgment calls on open-ended questions are all very important. Okay, so under our current system, who does get that power? Well, teachers, administrators, government officials, and rich people. If that last one seems out of place, I'd encourage you to look at how much influence Betsy DeVos had over our education system even before she became Secretary of Education.
Spoiler alert, she spent tens of millions of dollars trying to dismantle the institution of public education and replace it with for-profit schools.
The people who are deciding what standards students will be graded against are largely old, white, middle or upper class, neurotypical, able-bodied, and cisgender. So the things they decide are important for students to be graded on often have very little overlap with their lives. Like, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell became a meme because it was a shared experience of how disconnected what we learn in schools is from the realities of our daily lives. We need to radically broaden our definition of learning. Take, for instance, how we're taught to express our thoughts through essays in school. Forcing everyone to write an essay and then grading those essays based on how well they conform to traditional grammar structures is telling kids that some ways of expressing oneself are more legitimate and valuable than others. Not only does that end up disproportionately harming marginalized students, but by forcing everyone into a certain mold, it robs us all of our individuality and creativity. The class that I learned most from in high school was an English class where my teacher showed me that alternative ways of expressing oneself were valid. We had a project where we had to do some kind of presentation or artwork to represent where we feel most relaxed, or our free and easy space. I ended up making a video about how my free and easy space is inside my brain because I don't have to think in words and I can just kind of bounce rapidly from thought to thought. And that was a really authentic form of learning. I learned a lot about myself through that project. And every work of art and presentation that students shared cultivated a mutual understanding of one another that I found far more valuable to my life than whatever random essay I had to write. And that teacher really de-emphasized grading for that assignment. I think basically everyone got an A. I know I personally cared a lot less about my grade for that project than I did the feelings of exploration, community, and self-expression it provided me with.
Part 2. Grading normalizes unpaid overtime and busy work.
School is absolutely full of busy work. Some of it is obvious busy work, like word searches. I mean, what possible educational value could word searches have? Helping students read diagonally? They give the surface level appearance of education, like, hey look, letters! But don't actually teach anything. Other busy work, at least, is less obvious. You know, like forcing students to do a bunch of repetitions of math problems that have no bearing on their life. And trying to make a student focus on their work when the work isn't relevant or important to them is fighting a pointless uphill battle. I mean, you might get them to do it, but this interaction teaches students more about the power dynamics between themselves and the teacher than the actual content they're supposed to be learning. And the stuff that they learn this way probably won't stick. I mean, how much of what you were taught in your least favorite high school classes do you remember? Also, side note, does the fact that students by and large hate school bother anyone else? Like, that feels kind of important to me. The expectation that students should be working every moment they're in a classroom is a very useful foundation for capitalism to build off of. Forcing students to do homework or read a book when they're done with an assignment is like the educational equivalent of, if you have time to lean, you have time to clean. And that's not even getting into the ways that we saddle students with hours of work every night. Activist Aaron Ekins writes, I've come to the conclusion that the sole purpose of homework is to condition children into accepting that unpaid overtime, ridiculous hours, and not even being able to escape work in your own home are normal things to expect in their future. I agree with this tweet so hard that it inspired me to make this video. The reason why teachers think it's normal that they have to spend nights and weekends grading homework is precisely because they had to do that homework when they were in school. It's like we're trapped in some kind of intergenerational hamster wheel of pain.
Part 3. Lines in the sand.
As someone who quit teaching because of how much I hated grading, I can tell you with confidence, grading sucks. It takes forever and forces you to draw a whole bunch of arbitrary lines in the sand just to get through each day. I remember as a teacher being exhausted by the moral implications of every gray area of grading. Here's a real example from when I was teaching. I had given students a problem that looked something like this. Calculate the distance traveled by a race car in 4 seconds that starts from a stop and accelerates at 5 meters per second squared. So, there's an equation that fits very nicely here. d equals 1/2 at squared plus v0t, or distance equals 1/2 acceleration times time squared plus the initial velocity times time. And if you know this equation, solving the problem is pretty much just plugging in the variables. It requires very little critical thinking about what's actually going on. Which is not to say that the students who are just plugging in the numbers couldn't think about what it actually means, but a correct solution to the problem does not necessarily demonstrate to the teacher a deeper understanding of the concepts behind this equation. So, I had a student with a basic practical understanding of what it means for an object to accelerate, but who didn't know the formula, approach the problem by breaking up the motion of the car into 4 segments, figuring out how fast the car would be going during each of those, and then adding those distances together to get the total distance. Now, with the grading scale that I had been using, this student would get less credit than someone who got the right answer, but may or may not understand how the equation gave them that answer. Quick aside, although the student didn't realize it, there's actually a name for what they came up with. It's called a Riemann sum, and the act of me saying that just now may have granted the student's thought process more legitimacy in your mind. Like, because some German dude from the 1800s had the same idea, you probably subconsciously value that student's approach more now. Anyways, my point is that there are usually several different ways of approaching problems, and this student actually demonstrated some really creative thinking to solve a problem that they couldn't remember the formula for. If we stop limiting ourselves to thinking through the lens of who is right, we can use examples of student thinking as a springboard for class discussion. Like, this could have been a great opportunity to talk about the idea of alternative approaches and estimations when you don't have all the information to solve the problem with exact precision. Rather than objectively trying to rank student thought, we could have much more effective discussions if we focused on the situational advantages and limitations of different approaches. Unfortunately, teachers don't really have the ability to ponder this kind of stuff under our current system because they're drowning in grading. Like, this would happen to me every day as a teacher. I would spend 20 minutes contemplating the moral implications of how I was going about grading a particular question on one student's test, and meanwhile, I have 100 other tests I need to grade. It's simply impossible for teachers to give this kind of thought to each response, so we end up drawing arbitrary lines in the sand that say things like, half a point for getting the right number, half a point for having the right units, 1 point for the right equation. It's nonsense. And yeah, teachers try to develop ever more advanced grading systems that are capable of taking into account alternative approaches, but as long as we're trying to condense student learning into letter grades, someone is making decisions about what constitutes a higher grade than others. In some ways, it kind of reminds me of how liberals try to regulate away capitalism's problems. In both situations, society ends up chasing its tail trying to fix every problem with an unavoidably flawed system rather than just dismantling it.
Part 4. Grading is psychologically damaging.
Grading does immense psychological harm. A 2020 study from the journal Learning and Individual Differences found a direct relationship between self-esteem and math grades. That is, students with higher grades in math tended to have a higher self-esteem, and vice versa. When some students get lower grades than others, it signals to them that they are less intelligent, less hardworking, and less valuable than their peers. Grading sows the seeds of capitalism within us by teaching us to tie our self-worth to an abstract notion of productivity that's defined by an external power. If someone has internalized that they are a D student, they're less likely to question the crummy wages they'll be making under capitalism. Conversely, if someone has internalized that they are an A student, they're not likely to question the ways that the system might have benefited them if they become wealthy. Grading, like capitalism, is a system that sells personal responsibility as the solution to every problem, and in doing so, it erases all of the invisible barriers that students face. When a student gets a bad grade, the only thing that our system can say is, well, guess you didn't try hard enough.
Part 5. School doesn't have to suck.
What if we abolished grading? Now, I'm not saying that we should stop giving students feedback on their work. Feedback is necessary for growth, but that feedback should be a dialogue. Our current system just says, you did this wrong, do it better next time. It doesn't investigate what made it difficult for the student to do the task that was assigned and work to address those barriers. And it's worth noting that the dialogue about learning should flow both ways between students and teachers. Under our current system, students are given very little ability to provide their teachers with feedback. And that sucks. Like, I'm planning on making another video at some point about how schools could be more democratic, but for now I'll just say that the quality of their learning is being limited by the one-way nature of grading. When a student says, I'm bored, that's valuable information for the teacher. It means that something's not working, and the teacher probably needs to try another approach. If students had more opportunities to share their thoughts and feelings with teachers, the quality of instruction they would receive would increase, and they'd be more invested in their education. We've actually seen these kinds of dialogues happen on a small scale already, with some districts moving towards student-led parent-teacher conferences. In these cases, students are given the opportunity to center the dialogue on what's going on for them and how they feel about how things have been going in class. It's kind of awesome. If you're interested in learning more about that, I put a link in the description. So now, you might look at this and think, well, yeah, that all sounds great, but how on earth are teachers going to have enough time for this kind of back and forth personalized feedback and instruction every day? And yeah, you're right. That would take a lot of time. Our system is not built in a way that is conducive to that. We need to restructure our schools with way smaller class sizes so that teachers and students can actually engage in personalized learning. And please don't tell me that we can't afford this, because that's just straight up false. I think what upsets me more than anything else is the way that our education system stifles student curiosity. Grading teaches students to compare themselves to one another and seek extrinsic rewards for learning, rather than teaching them to develop a deep appreciation for the act of learning itself. Like, it's sad that school is made to be such a miserable place for students. Think about the potential that school has. Imagine if there was somewhere you could go for 7 hours a day where you just got to be social with your friends, relax, hang out, and learn about things you're curious about that are relevant to your life. That would be amazing. And I really do think that it would be possible if we could just get over this weird hang-up we have where we feel the need to rank students against one another.
Conclusion.
I think 100 years from now, provided human life still exists, people will be able to look back on the practice of grading with horror and clarity, seeing it for what it is. A system designed to prime us for the injustices of capitalism. Grading lays the groundwork for capitalism by teaching students to think that the only reason that people would ever do work is for personal reward, see a never-ending stream of work as healthy and normal, believe that people can be sorted into objective hierarchies, and internalize where they belong within those hierarchies. So if we want to dismantle capitalism and replace it with a more just system that's devoid of hierarchies and where every human life has value, I think abolishing grading is a step we need to take. Hey, thanks for watching. This one took a while. I had a lot of ideas I wanted to get out, and I had a really hard time organizing my thoughts. If you found this video insightful and want to help me become a full-time YouTuber, I recently set up a Patreon, so you can donate over at patreon.com/RyanHibbs. Please only give if you're in a financial position where it's comfortable to do so. And if you want to support my channel, but can't afford to donate to my Patreon, liking, commenting, and subscribing are all great ways to help gain the attention of the all-powerful YouTube algorithm. See you next time!